The end of the dream. It started as the most iconic band in history, the Beatles, for young men who changed the world with their music, forever altering the course of rock and roll. But what went wrong? How did it all fall apart? From the outside, it seemed perfect. Four best friends making history with every song, each album a masterpiece. But behind the music, tensions were rising, and the dream was slipping away. Their once unshakable bond began to crack, and what was supposed to be a lifelong partnership slowly turned into a battlefield of egos, resentment, and disagreements. It wasn't always this way. In the early days, the Beatles were inseparable. They thrived on their collective creativity, each member bringing something special to the table. But as the years passed, so did the unity. The harmony they once had started to sour, leading to their eventual breakup. John Lennon, the visionary, had begun to pull away from the group, feeling disconnected from the others. His interests were changing. He was no longer just a playful Beatle. He had transformed into an artist with a message. Meanwhile, Paul McCartney, the perfectionist, grew more controlling, wanting to steer the band in a direction that suited his growing ambitions. George Harrison, the quiet genius, felt increasingly frustrated. His contributions were often overlooked, and he was no longer content to sit in the background. As for Ringo Starr, he was the glue that held it together, but even he couldn't stop the cracks from widening. The Beatles weren't just breaking up as a band, they were breaking apart as friends. And it was only a matter of time before the cracks would completely split them. The creative divide. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were a creative force unlike any other. They had pushed boundaries with their music, experimenting with new sounds, genres, and instruments. But the very thing that made them unique was also their downfall. Their creativity was no longer in sync. John Lennon, always the rebel, was growing tired of the commercial machine that the Beatles had become. He yearned for something deeper, something more experimental. Paul McCartney, on the other hand, was fixated on perfection, always aiming for a polished, radio-friendly sound. Their differing visions clashed violently, and the studio became a war zone. But it wasn't just the music. The group's personal lives were starting to take a toll. John had married Yoko Ono, and her presence in the studio caused an uproar. Paul's relationship with his longtime girlfriend, Linda, also became a source of tension. George Harrison, who had always been the quiet observer, was fed up with being ignored and was now actively seeking a way out. The band was no longer just fighting over music. They were fighting over who they were as individuals. The unity that had once been their strength had transformed into division. The infamous Let It Be sessions. In 1969, the Beatles entered the studio to record what would become their final album together, Let It Be. It was supposed to be a return to their roots, but instead, it became a symbol of their disintegration. The sessions were a nightmare. Tensions ran high, with each member of the band at odds with the others. John was disengaged, more interested in his solo career than in being part of the band. Paul was trying to keep everything together, but his controlling nature was pushing the others away. George was growing increasingly frustrated with Paul's dominance, and Ringo was just tired of the whole situation. But the real turning point came when the band tried to film a documentary about the making of the album. Instead of capturing the magic of their creativity, the cameras caught the raw emotions and tension that had been building for months. The joy of making music together was gone, replaced by bitterness and mistrust. By the time they finished Let It Be, the Beatles were no longer a cohesive unit. They were a group of talented individuals who could no longer work together. The final break. The writing was on the wall, and it was only a matter of time before the Beatles officially called it quits. After Let It Be, the band took a break, but tensions were still simmering beneath the surface. John Lennon was the first to leave, announcing that he was done with the Beatles in 1969, although he didn't publicly break up the band until later. He had already started his solo career with his album Plastic Ono Band, which reflected his growing desire to move away from the group. Paul McCartney was devastated. He tried everything he could to keep the band together, but by 1970, it was clear that it was over. He released his first solo album, and in doing so, officially sealed the fate of the Beatles. The band was no more. The breakup was messy. Legal battles ensued, with each member fighting over the band's legacy and the rights to their music. They had once been brothers, but now they were enemies. After the Beatles, once the Beatles had disbanded, the four members went on to pursue their own solo careers, but none of them could escape the shadow of their former band. Paul McCartney found success with Wings, but his music was never quite the same without the synergy of the Beatles. John Lennon went on to become an activist, using his fame to speak out against war and injustice, but he also struggled with personal demons. George Harrison released several solo albums, and while he had success, it was clear that his heart was still with the Beatles. Ringo Starr, the most easygoing of the group, continued to make music, but his best days were behind him. Even as they achieved success in their individual careers, there was always an underlying sadness. The Beatles had been more than just a band. They had been a family, and that family had been torn apart. Years later, the surviving members would occasionally reunite for special projects, but the magic was gone. The dream of the Beatles, the unity, the brotherhood, was nothing more than a memory. The legacy that lives on. Despite everything, the Beatles' legacy lived on. The music they made together continues to inspire generations of fans. Their songs are timeless, still played on the radio, still being covered by artists around the world. But behind the music is a story of friendship, creativity, and heartbreak. The Beatles' story is a reminder that even the greatest bands are not immune to the forces that tear them apart. Egos, artistic differences, and personal struggles can fracture even the most powerful of friendships. But their music remains as a testament to what they were and what they could have been. Their story may have ended in discord, but their impact on music and on the world will never fade. The Beatles are no longer a band, but their songs will continue to be a source of comfort and inspiration long after the last note fades away. Their rise, their fall, and their unforgettable legacy will remain, forever embedded in the hearts of those who continue to listen.